save perhaps Babemba, believed us to be slave traders, a race that very properly they held in abhorrence, who had visited the country with the object of stealing their women and children. The king, Bausi, a very prejudiced fellow, was dead against us. Also, by a piece of foolishness which I now bitterly regretted, as indeed I regretted the whole expedition, or at any rate entering into it on the absence of Brother John, we had made an implacable enemy of the head medicine man, who to these folk was a sort of Archbishop of Canterbury. Short of a miracle there was no hope for us. All that we could do was to say our prayers and prepare for the end. Mavovo, it is true, remained cheerful. His faith in his Snake was really touching. He offered to go through that divination process again in our presence and demonstrate that there was no mistake. I declined because I had no faith in divinations, and Stephen also declined for another reason, namely that the result might prove to be different, which, he held, would be depressing. The other Zulus oscillated between belief and scepticism, as do the unstable who set to work to study the evidences of Christianity. But Sammy did not oscillate. He literally howled, and prepared the food which poured in upon us so badly that I had to turn on Hans to do the cooking, for however little appetite we might have, it was necessary that we should keep up our strength by eating. "What, Mr. Quatermain," asked Sammy between his tears, "is the use of dressing viands that our systems will never have time to thoroughly assimilate?" The first night passed somehow, and so did the next day and the next night, which heralded our last morning. I got up quite early and watched the sunrise. Never, I think, had I realized before what a beautiful thing the sunrise is, at least not to the extent that I did now when I was saying good-bye to it for ever. Unless, indeed, there should prove to be still lovelier sunrises beyond the dark of death. Then I went into our hut, and as Stephen, who had the nerves of a rhinoceros, was still sleeping like a tortoise in winter, I said my prayers earnestly enough, mourned over my sins, which proved to be so many that at last I gave up the job in despair, and then tried to occupy myself by reading the Old Testament, a book to which I have always been extremely attached. As a passage that I lit on described how the prophet Samuel, for whom I could not help reading Imbozwi, hewed Agag in pieces after Bausi, I mean Saul, had relented and spared his life, I cannot say that it consoled me very much. Doubtless, I reflected, these people believed that I, like Agag, had made women childless by my sword, so there remained nothing save to follow the example of that unhappy king and walk delicately to doom. Then, as Stephen was still sleeping, how could he do it, I wondered, I set to work to make up the accounts of the expedition to date. It had already cost £1,423. Just fancy expending £1,423 in order to be tied to a post and shot to death with arrows, and all to get a rare orchid. Oh! I reflected to myself, if by some marvel I should escape, or if I should live again in any land where these particular flowers flourish, I would never even look at them, and, as a matter of fact, I never have. At length Stephen did wake up, and, as criminals are reported to do in the papers before execution, made an excellent breakfast. "What's the good of worrying?" he said presently. "I shouldn't if it weren't for my poor old father. It must have come to this one day, and the sooner it is over the sooner to sleep, as the song says. When one comes to think of it, there are enormous advantages in sleep, for that's the only time one is quite happy. Still, I should have liked to see that Cypripedium first." "Oh, drat the Cypripedium!" I exclaimed, and blundered from the hut to tell Sammy that if he didn't stop his groaning I would punch his head. "Jumps, regular jumps! Who'd have thought it of Quatermain?" I heard Stephen mutter in the intervals of lighting his pipe. "The morning went like lightning that is greased," as Sammy remarked. 3 o'clock came, and Mavovo and his following sacrificed a kid to the spirits of their ancestors, which, as Sammy remarked again, was "a horrible heathen ceremony, much calculated to prejudice our cause with the powers above." When it was over, to my delight, Babemba appeared. He looked so pleasant that I jumped to the conclusion that he had brought the best of news with him. Perhaps the king had pardoned us, or perhaps, blessed thought, that Brother John had already arrived before his time. But not a bit of it. All he had to say was that he had caused inquiries to be made along the route that ran to the coast, and that certainly for 100 miles there was at present no sign of Dogeetah. So, as the black elephant was growing more and more enraged under the stirrings up of Imbozwi, It was obvious that the evening ceremony must be performed. Indeed, as it was part of his duty to superintend the erection of the posts to which we were to be tied, and the digging of our graves at their bases, he had just come to count us again to be sure that he had not made any mistakes as to the number. Also, if there were any articles that we would like buried with us, would we be so kind as to point them out, and he would be sure to see to the matter. It would be soon over, and not painful, he added, as he had selected the very best archers in Beza Town, who rarely missed, and could, most of them, send an arrow up to the feather into a buffalo. Then he chatted a little about other matters, as to where he should find the magic shield I had given him, which he would always value as a souvenir, etc., took a pinch of snuff with Mavovo and departed, saying that he would be sure to return again at the proper time. It was now 4 o'clock, and as Sammy was quite beyond it, Stephen made himself some tea. It was very good tea, especially as we had milk to put in it, although I did not remember what it tasted like afterwards. Now, having abandoned hope, I went into a hut alone to compose myself to meet my end like a gentleman, and seated there in silence and semi-darkness my spirit grew much calmer. After all, I reflected, why should I cling to life? In the country whither I travelled, as the reader who has followed my adventures will know, were some whom I clearly longed to see again, notably my father and mother, and two noble women who were even more to me. My boy, it is true, remained. He was alive then, but I knew that he would find friends, and as I was not so badly off at that time, I had been able to make a proper provision for him. Perhaps it was better that I should go, seeing that if I lived on it would only mean more troubles and more partings. What was about to befall me, of course, I could not tell, but I knew then as I know now that it was not extinction, or even that sleep of which Stephen had spoken. Perhaps I was passing to some place where at length the clouds would roll away, and I should understand. Whence, too, I should see all the landscape of the past and future, as an eagle does watching from the skies, and be no longer like one struggling through dense bush, wild beast, and serpent-haunted, beat upon by the storms of heaven and terrified with its lightnings, nor knowing whither I hewed my path. Perhaps in that place there would be no longer what St. Paul describes as another law in my members warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin. Perhaps the past would be forgiven by the Power which knows whereof we are made, and I should become what I have always longed to be, good in every sense, and even find open to me new and better roads of service. I take these thoughts from a note that I made in my pocket-book at the time. Thus I reflected, and then wrote a few lines of farewell in the fond and foolish hope that somehow they might find those to whom they were addressed. I have those letters still, and very oddly they read to-day. This done, I tried to throw out my mind towards Brother John if he still lived, as indeed I had done for days past, so that I might inform him of our plight, and, I am afraid, reproach him for having brought us to such an end by his insane carelessness or want of faith. Whilst I was still engaged thus, Babemba arrived with his soldiers to lead us off to execution. It was Hans who came to tell me that he was there. The poor old Hottentot shook me by the hand and wiped his eyes with his ragged coat sleeve. "Oh, Baas, this is our last journey," he said, "and you are going to be killed, Baas, and it is all my fault, Baas, because I ought to have found a way out of the trouble which is what I was hired to do, but I can't, my head grows so stupid. Oh, if only I could come even with Imbozwi I shouldn't mind, but I will, if I have to return as a ghost to do it. Well, Baas, you know the Predikant, your father, told us that we don't go out like a fire, but burn again for always elsewhere." I hope not, I thought to myself. "And that quite easily without anything to pay for the wood. So I hope that we shall always burn together, Baas. And meanwhile I have brought you a little something," and he produced what looked like a peculiarly obnoxious horseball. "You swallow this now and you will never feel anything. It is very good medicine that my grandfather's grandfather got from the spirit of his tribe. You will just go to sleep as nicely as though you were very drunk, and wake up in the beautiful fire which burns without any wood and never goes out for ever and ever. Amen." "No, Hans," I said, "I prefer to die with my eyes open." And so would I, Baas, if I thought there were any good in keeping them open, but I don't, for I can't believe any more in the Snake of